Hey, so my name is J. Crimson Rose DaCosta. I am the curator of a project called Erotic Pedagogy, which features storytelling videos from queer and trans, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, speaking to their experiences with sexual education in so-called Canada. I also curated a public sociology project from 2014 until 2019, sharing concepts and ideas from and regarding sociology. I was getting a PhD at the time, and now I have a PhD in sociology. However, I also have a BA in English literature and do a lot of work in my academic work within sociology around storytelling and narrative. And I also am a creative writer outside of academia and within academia too. And on top of all that, an avid reader. And I was thinking about something I am doing videos. I want to do videos now on giving short book reviews on the many books that I read, particularly from, this analytical eye that I have around narrative, storytelling, and kind of social themes, I guess. And the video I want to start with is The Pallbearers Club by Paul Tremblay. And I wanted to start with this because what I saw online, the reviews I've seen online, although I didn't do a whole deep dive into it, but from what I saw, a lot of people don't like this book. And so Paul Tremblay, you probably know him from writing, it depends how you engage the media, but he wrote the book, The Cabin at the End of the World, which was then a featured film. I love the film, I didn't read the book though. But I have read his book's horror movie, which was great. And after reading that, I decided to read The Pallbearers Club. And when I was looking at it, different reviews on it online, people really hated the book. And so, maybe not everyone really hated the book, but what I saw, it seemed like people considered it a deviation from his other more acclaimed novels and creations and short stories. And I thought that was curious because what the book's about, it's about a guy named Art Barbara, although that's not his name, although maybe it is, but the character is Art Barbara. He is writing a memoir that also might be a novel about his experiences starting with the Pallbearer Club, where him and initially two other students, but mostly him and he's in high school, him and this other woman who's not in high school who reach out to him through flyers he posts about the Pallbearers Club. They go to funerals and they're pallbearers, right? So it's funerals for the elderly, the those without family or connections, people who don't have people attending their funerals, the unhoused, stuff like that. And so he starts this as a high school club, and he puts out flyers, and this other person who's named Mercy in the book / memoir comes and helps him. And during their volunteering services, she takes pictures of the dead in their casket with a Polaroid. And the story kind of unfolds from there, where what's happening is the main character, Art Barbara, is narrating his memoir, and Mercy is actually the editor on the book. And so it goes between their two different perspectives, and it's the memoir / novel is written from I think the 90s, or it's written about the 80s from the 2007, and then also revisited in 2014, and then is published or being edited in 2017. And the novel moves between these two different specters. Art Barbara, the author or memoirist, and Mercy, who is the editor, but also was a part of the story. And what's really cool from the get-go is the idea of using an author and an editor as a format of storytelling. And I think it's one that would particularly appeal to writers, where it both illustrates the dialogue that happens between an author and an editor during the editing process, but how also stories get shaped and reshaped and created to meet a certain genre. But also part of this is, and the reason I keep saying genre, memoir / novel, is that Mercy is claiming the entire time that Art Barbara is writing a novel, that it's fiction, where Art is saying he's writing a memoir. And in the spirit of this, the book itself kind of is a genre bending. It moves between, I think, different memoir formats and novel formats and brings them together for the story. And from what I know from Paul Tremblay, in his typical fashion, there is an unreliable narrator. But what's interesting about this, in using both the editor and the author as the narrators, you don't know who the main narrator is of the book, and you don't know who is unreliable or not as a result of that. And so there's this interesting thing going on that's just captivating in that it's moving between these two perspectives, but then also it allows for a continual guessing game around who the narrator is and who you can trust, which in and of itself is another thing I think it would appeal to writers, illustrates again the creation and fiction that goes into storytelling, the plotting, it illustrates the perspective of narrative, both in the storytelling formats, such as books, memoirs, novels, but also in life. But it was incredibly captivating in how you kind of like get into this story that Art's sharing, and then you kind of get suspended from this story while also adding layers to the story through the editor. Maybe this is a book that's written for writers. I think maybe one of the reasons people don't like it is that it is bending these genres of memoir and novel, fact and fiction, although in line with the book, I would agree that memoirs themselves aren't actually facts. They're also narratives, just a different type. And in bending this, there's moments where, for example, Art goes on and on about describing things. And some of the reviews I saw online were saying, oh, he spends too much time describing stuff. But then in this dialogue between the author and the editor, you see these moments where the editor actually calls him out on it and makes fun of him and is like, you should edit this, you should change it. And I think these decisions that maybe aren't as appealing to the author, to the reader in the moment, use rhetorical literary devices for this editor voice narrative as well, this component of it. And similarly, it's a book that also, through engaging the punk scene in which Art and Mercy are a part of during, I guess, the 80s and the 90s, they talk often about commercialism and consumerism, and I think that's another underlying theme that's going on here. And so I think in this way it's like kind of pushing back around consumerist norms, it's gender bending, and it's kind of book that if you were teaching like a writing course, I think you would assign to illustrate like narration, rhetorical devices, literary devices. Like it's really getting at this idea of voice and narrative perspectives in book, which I love. And I would kind of call it, and maybe that's another reason people don't love it so much. It is horror, but it's what I would call it is it's literary horror, which are books that are either using the horror genre to do things that we traditionally associate with like classic literature. So identity, exploration, like oppression, resistance, like these kind of narratives we often kind of say, oh, this is part of literary fiction. Literary horror are books that, for me, that use the horror genre to explore these literary tropes. And a really good example of that is Delicious Monsters by Leslie Sudbury, I believe is her name. She's a Canadian author. She's fantastic. And then on the flip side, there's also literary horror novels that are horrors, the horror novels that use the genre of horror to explore literary and rhetorical devices around narration. So another prime example of that would be The Last Word by Taylor Adams, which is actually one of my favorite books. And I would say this book is both. It is using horror as a genre to explore identity and self, maybe teenage angst, a coming of age story, but also, and probably more poignantly or more often, is exploring literary devices and narrative through the horror genre. And for me, I think that's really cool and something that would appeal to writers. And I also think the book Horror Movie does something very similar to the book Pallbearers Club, except for Horror Movie I think is more firmly based in meta horror and is within that, I don't want to say discipline, but genre of film, and is talking back to meta horror film. So it's doing it a different way, but the kind of feel of both things are quite similar. And I think that if you like Horror Movie, you would also like Pallbearers Club, although that doesn't seem to always be the case. But I thought both were fantastic. So yeah, definitely recommend Pallbearers Club to folks.